For 2 years, I lived as his wife, and he never touched me once. The chandelier lights spilled across the marble floor, soft and golden, reflecting off surfaces too polished to feel real, too perfect to feel warm, and Claire Dawson stood at the center of it all, barefoot, still, her fingers resting lightly against the cold edge of a dining table meant for 12, but used by one, sometimes two, never together, the silence of the mansion pressing in around her like something alive, something watching, something waiting, and somewhere above her, a clock ticked, steady and indifferent, marking the passage of time she had already memorized by heart, 730 days. Exactly 2 years since she had signed her name on a contract that turned her into Mrs. Claire Blackwood, wife of Ethan Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in New York, a man whose name opened doors, closed deals, and built empires, but never once crossed the distance between them, not even by an inch, not even by accident, not even on their wedding night, and she could still remember it. The way the room had looked just like this, immaculate, silent, untouched, the way he had stood by the window instead of beside her, his voice calm, almost detached, as he said, "This marriage is an arrangement. Nothing more." And she had nodded because she needed this, needed the security, needed the solution he offered, needed to believe that survival sometimes came before everything else, even before dignity, even before the quiet, unspoken hope that maybe, just maybe, something real could grow from something so carefully defined. But nothing had grown, not in 2 years, not in 730 nights of sleeping in a bed too large for one person and too empty for two, not in the brief, polite conversations that never lasted longer than a few minutes, not in the carefully scheduled appearances where they smiled for cameras like strangers pretending to recognize each other, and especially not in the distance he maintained, always precise, always intentional, like an invisible line drawn between them that neither of them dared to cross, and Claire had learned to live with it, or at least to pretend she had, learned to move through the house without making noise, learned to read his moods from the way his footsteps echoed down the hallway, learned to exist in the spaces he left behind rather than the ones he occupied. But tonight felt different, and she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the air seemed heavier, or the way the silence wasn't empty but charged, like something just beneath the surface was about to break. Or maybe it was simply the realization that 2 years was too long to remain invisible, too long to keep waiting for something that was never promised, too long to ignore the question that had followed her every single day since she became his wife. Why would a man marry someone only to never touch her? And as Claire slowly lifted her hand, her eyes drifting toward the grand staircase where shadows pooled in the corners, she felt something shift inside her, something quiet but unshakable, and for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The first time Claire Dawson realized something was truly wrong was not on their wedding night, not in the quiet mornings that followed, and not even in the long stretches of silence that filled the mansion like an unspoken agreement. It was a Tuesday evening in early October, exactly 43 days after she had moved in, when the rain tapped softly against the tall windows and the city beyond blurred into streaks of gold and gray. And she had come downstairs expecting to find the house empty like always, only to see Ethan standing in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, his posture sharp and controlled as he poured himself a glass of water. And for a moment she had paused at the edge of the doorway, unsure whether to step in or retreat, because moments like this were rare, unscripted, and somehow more unsettling than the distance itself. And when he finally noticed her, his eyes lifted just briefly, calm, unreadable, before he gave a small nod that was more acknowledgement than greeting, and she had forced herself to walk forward, her voice careful, steady, asking something simple, something safe. "You are home early." And he had replied just as evenly. Meeting was canceled. Nothing more, nothing less. The conversation already ending before it began, but then something unexpected had happened, something so small it should not have mattered, and yet it stayed with her long after. Because as he reached for the glass, their hands had almost brushed, just barely, a fraction of an inch, and in that instant, Ethan had pulled back, not abruptly, not dramatically, but deliberately, as if the distance between them was not accidental but chosen, calculated, protected, and Claire had felt it, that invisible line again, stronger than ever, clearer than ever. A boundary that did not exist in words, but in every movement he made. And she had stood there, her fingers still slightly raised, her breath caught. Somewhere between confusion and something she did not want to name, watching as he stepped away, placing the glass down with quiet precision before turning to leave the room entirely. As if even proximity itself was something to avoid, and that was the moment it settled into her. Not as a question anymore, but as a truth she could not ignore. This was not indifference, it was intention, every step, every silence. Every careful inch of space between them was chosen, and over the weeks that followed she began to notice more. The way he never entered a room if she was already too close to the doorway. The way he always stood at least an arm's length away during public appearances. The way even in photographs his hand hovered just slightly behind her back, without ever making contact. A perfect illusion of closeness without the reality of it. And Claire adapted because she had to. She learned the rhythm of his distance. Memorized the choreography of a marriage that looked flawless from the outside and felt hollow within. She stopped expecting accidental touches, stopped wondering if one day he might forget the rules he had written into their lives. And instead she built her own quiet routine inside the spaces he left untouched. But the more she adjusted, the more the question deepened, not why he would not touch her, but why he could not, because there was something in his restraint that did not feel cold, not entirely. Something beneath it that felt heavier, like a secret carefully buried beneath control. And now, standing in the same house 2 years later, that memory returned to her with startling clarity, because for the first time, she was no longer willing to live inside a question that had never been answered. Claire did not sleep that night, not because the house was loud or restless, but because it was too quiet, the kind of silence that made every thought echo louder than it should. And as she lay in the center of a bed that felt far too large for one person, her eyes fixed on the ceiling where soft shadows moved with the passing headlights from the street below, she found herself counting again, not sheep, not minutes, but patterns, moments, details she had ignored for too long, because once she allowed herself to look at them clearly, they no longer felt like coincidences, they felt like pieces of something carefully constructed, something deliberate. And sometime past midnight, when the digital clock beside her bed turned 2:17 a.m., she heard it, a faint sound from down the hallway, not loud enough to alarm, but distinct enough to notice, a door closing softly, followed by footsteps, measured, controlled, familiar. And Claire sat up slowly, her heart picking up not from fear, but from something closer to realization, because Ethan never moved around the house at this hour. At least not when she was aware of it. His routines were precise, predictable, almost mechanical, and yet tonight, something had shifted, and before she could stop herself, she slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent against the polished wood floor as she moved toward the door, opening it just enough to peer into the dimly lit hallway where the golden wall sconces cast long shadows that stretched toward the staircase. And there, at the far end, she saw him, his back to her, standing in front of a door she had never seen open before, a door she had always assumed led to a storage room or some unused space, because in 2 years, it had remained closed, untouched, almost invisible, and yet now it stood slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling into the hallway, and Ethan paused there for a moment, his hand resting against the frame as if hesitating, as if considering something, before he stepped inside and quietly shut it behind him. The click of the latch echoing softly through the silence, and Claire remained where she was, her fingers gripping the edge of the door, her breath shallow as the realization settled deeper, heavier. This was not routine. This was not accidental. This was something hidden, something intentionally kept out of sight, and for the first time since she had entered this house as his wife, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a truth she had never been meant to see. And she did not move for what felt like several minutes, her mind racing through possibilities she could not fully form, until finally, slowly, carefully, she stepped into the hallway, her gaze fixed on that door at the far end, the one place in this entire mansion that did not belong to her, not even in name. And as she walked toward it, each step quieter than the last, she could feel the weight of 2 years pressing against her chest, every unanswered question, every moment of distance, every almost touch that never happened, leading her here, to this single point of decision, because whatever was behind that door was no longer just his secret. It was the answer to everything she had been trying not to ask, and when she finally stopped just inches away from it, her hand lifting slowly toward the handle, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of certainty, because she knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that once she opened that door, nothing between them would ever remain the same again. Claire's fingers hovered just inches from the handle, her breath slow and measured as if even the air around her might betray her presence. And for a moment, she almost stepped back, almost convinced herself that this was not her place, that whatever lay behind that door belonged to Ethan alone, just like everything else in this house had always seemed to. But then something inside her shifted, something quiet but resolute, because she was not just a guest here, not just a name on a contract. She was his wife, even if only in title, and she deserved answers that 2 years of silence had never given her. And before she could hesitate again, her hand closed around the handle and gently turned it, the latch releasing with a soft click that sounded louder than it should in the stillness of the hallway. And slowly, carefully, she pushed the door open just enough to see inside, expecting something ordinary, something explainable. But what she found was neither, because the room was not empty, not forgotten, not unused. It was alive with intention, lit by a single desk lamp that cast a warm, focused glow across a space that felt nothing like the rest of the mansion, where everything else had been polished, distant, impersonal. This room was precise, detailed, almost obsessive, walls lined with neatly arranged folders, documents stacked in careful order, a large desk positioned at the center with papers spread across its surface in a way that suggested constant use rather than display. And Claire stepped inside without realizing she had moved, her eyes scanning the room as a quiet unease settled in her chest, because this was not a storage room. This was not a forgotten space. This was something deliberate, something hidden in plain sight. And then she saw it, not the documents at first, not the files or the notes, but a photograph pinned to a board on the far wall, and her breath caught, because the woman in the photo was her, taken from across the street, candid, unaware, standing outside a small coffee shop she had not visited in over 2 years, her hair pulled back, her coat too thin for the winter air, her expression tired but determined, and Claire froze where she stood, her mind struggling to catch up with what her eyes were seeing, because this was not recent, this was from before the contract, before the marriage, before Ethan had ever entered her life. And slowly, almost unwillingly, her gaze shifted to the other images surrounding it, more photographs, more moments captured without her knowledge, each one documenting pieces of a life she had thought was entirely her own, and beneath them, notes, dates, timelines, all organized with a precision that made her stomach tighten, because this was not curiosity, this was investigation, and her hand trembled slightly as she reached for one of the folders on the desk, opening it just enough to glimpse the contents inside. Pages filled with typed reports, references to her name, her past, her routine, details no stranger should have known. And suddenly the silence of the room felt different, heavier, as if it carried the weight of something she was only beginning to understand. And Claire took a slow step back, her pulse quickening not from fear, but from the overwhelming clarity of what this meant, because Ethan had not chosen her randomly, had not married her out of convenience alone. He had been watching her long before she ever knew he existed, and as that realization settled into her chest, sharp and undeniable, a single question rose above all the others, louder than anything she had ever asked herself in 2 years, not why he would not touch her, but why he had been watching her at all. Claire did not remember stepping back, only that suddenly the room felt too small, too full, as if every photograph on the wall was watching her in return, and the air she had breathed without question for 2 years now pressed against her chest in a way that made it hard to think clearly, because this was no longer just a secret. It was a history she had never been told, a version of her life that existed without her knowledge. And as her eyes moved again across the board, she began to notice the details she had missed in the first shock, the dates written neatly beneath each photograph, the notes attached in clean, precise handwriting, the timelines connecting moments she had once believed were random. And slowly, piece by piece, something began to form, Not chaos, not obsession, but structure, intention, purpose, and her hand lifted again, this time steadier, reaching for a document that lay open on the desk as if it had been left mid-thought, and she leaned closer, her gaze scanning the lines, recognizing her own name, her old address, the coffee shop she used to visit every morning at exactly 8:15. The part-time job she had taken after her mother's hospital bills began to pile up, every detail accurate, every detail accounted for. And yet what unsettled her most was not the information itself but the tone, because it was not written like surveillance, not cold or detached, but careful, almost protective, as if whoever had compiled it was not simply watching but guarding. And Claire swallowed slowly, her mind racing through possibilities she could not fully grasp, because nothing about this fit the version of Ethan she had known, the man who spoke in measured words, who kept distance like a rule he could not break, who treated their marriage like a transaction defined by boundaries. And yet this room told a different story, one that began long before she had ever signed that contract, one that suggested she had never been a stranger to him at all. And then her eyes caught something else, a smaller photograph set apart from the others, not pinned with notes or connected by lines, just placed there, almost deliberately isolated. And she stepped closer, her breath slowing as she took it in, because it was the oldest one, taken years ago, and in it she looked younger, standing beside her mother outside a hospital, her arm wrapped gently around her as they both smiled at something outside the frame, unaware of being watched, unaware of being captured, and beneath it, in handwriting she now recognized as Ethan's, were just a few words, simple, quiet, but heavier than anything else in the room. She stayed. And Claire felt something shift inside her, something deeper than confusion, deeper than fear, because this was not about curiosity or control. This was about something she did not yet understand, something rooted in a moment she could not fully remember. And for the first time since stepping into this room, her thoughts slowed, focusing not on what he had done, but on why. Because there had to be a reason, something that connected her life to his in a way that went beyond contracts and appearances. And as she stood there, the silence no longer empty, but filled with meaning she was only beginning to see. One truth became impossible to ignore. Ethan had not married her by chance, and whatever had brought her into his world had started long before she ever walked down that aisle. And somewhere in this room, in these pages, in these carefully preserved moments, was the answer she had been living beside for 2 years without ever knowing it. Claire did not hear him enter, not at first, because her attention was still fixed on those 2 words beneath the photograph, simple and quiet, and somehow heavier than everything else in the room. She stayed. And for a brief moment she found herself searching her memory, trying to place it, trying to recall that day outside the hospital with a clarity she had never needed before. But memories were not precise things. They blurred, softened, shifted with time, and just as she began to feel that faint frustration rising, a voice behind her broke the silence, calm, steady, unmistakable. "You were not supposed to see this." And Claire turned instantly, her breath catching as Ethan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable as always. But there was something different in the way he held himself, something less controlled, less distant, as if the careful balance he had maintained for 2 years had finally been disturbed. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them no longer defined by silence, but by something far more fragile, something exposed. And Claire felt it, that shift, that undeniable awareness that whatever had existed between them before this moment was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be, but it did not break. "You have been watching me." The words simple, direct, impossible to soften, and Ethan did not deny it, did not look away, did not offer the kind of explanation that would make it easier to understand. Instead, he stepped into the room slowly, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any argument. And for the first time since she had known him, there was hesitation in his silence, not the controlled pause she had grown used to, but something heavier, something that suggested the truth was not something he could easily give. And Claire felt her heart begin to race, not from fear, but from the weight of everything she now knew, everything she had seen, and everything that still did not make sense. "Why?" she asked, the single word sharper than any accusation, because it carried 2 years of unanswered questions within it. And Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the wall, toward the photographs, toward the version of her life he had preserved in ways she had never imagined, before returning to her. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it, not cold, not distant, but something closer to honest. Because you were not supposed to be alone that day. And Claire frowned slightly, confusion flickering across her face as she tried to follow the meaning behind his words. Because she did not remember being alone, not in any way that stood out, not in any way that would explain this. And yet there was something in his tone that made her pause, something that told her this was not a simple answer, not a surface-level truth. And before she could press further, Ethan took another step forward, stopping just far enough away to maintain that familiar distance, that invisible line that still existed even now, even here, even after everything had been revealed. And it was that distance that struck her most, because even in a moment like this, even when the truth was finally within reach, he still could not cross it. And Claire felt something inside her tighten, not just from confusion now, but from something deeper, something closer to frustration, because whatever this was, whatever he had built around her life, whatever reason he believed justified it, it had kept her at a distance for 2 years, and she was no longer willing to accept answers that only led to more silence. And as she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time without the barrier of assumptions or expectations, she realized something that changed everything again. Ethan Blackwood was not just hiding a secret, he was protecting something, and somehow, impossibly, that something was her. Claire held his gaze, searching for something that would make sense of the quiet weight behind his words. But the more she looked, the more she realized this was not a man who explained things easily, not because he could not, but because whatever truth he carried had been buried for far too long to be spoken without consequence. And she felt it in the way he stood there, still maintaining that careful distance, as if even now, even after everything had been exposed, he was holding something back, something that mattered more than his own comfort, more than her understanding. And her voice softened, not out of surrender but out of determination. That day. What are you talking about? And Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes shifting briefly as if pulling a memory forward that he had not intended to revisit. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something different, something less guarded, something closer to truth than she had ever heard from him before. 3 years ago, outside St. Mary's Hospital, and Claire's breath caught, because she knew that place, knew it too well, the long nights, the waiting rooms, the quiet conversations with doctors she barely understood, the fear she never showed to her mother. And suddenly the image from the photograph sharpened in her mind, no longer distant or abstract but real, immediate, personal. And Ethan continued, his words measured but no longer detached. You were sitting on the steps, alone, after visiting your mother, and there was a man who approached you. And Claire frowned slightly, her memory searching for something, anything that matched his description, but all she could recall was exhaustion, the kind that blurred faces and voices into nothing. And Ethan's gaze hardened just slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to resolve. You told him no, he said, and there was a pause, brief but heavy, as if those words carried more meaning than they appeared to. And Claire felt a faint unease stir within her, not fear, but the unsettling awareness that something important had happened in that moment, something she had not fully understood at the time. And Ethan stepped closer, just slightly, still not crossing the invisible line between them, but close enough that his presence felt different now, more immediate, more real. Most people would have walked away after that, he continued, but you stayed where you were. You did not leave your mother's side. You did not take the easier way out, even when you had every reason to. And Claire's heart tightened, because she remembered that feeling, the choice to stay, not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because it was the only thing she could live with. And for a moment, the room seemed to shift around her, the photographs, the documents, all of it beginning to align into something she could finally begin to understand, not as surveillance, not as control, but as something else. Entirely, something rooted in that single moment she had never realized mattered to anyone but her. And when Ethan spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. I was there that night. And Claire looked at him sharply, The weight of those words landing all at once, because this was not coincidence, not chance. This was connection, one she had never seen until now. And he held her gaze, steady, unflinching, as he added, "And you were the only one who did not leave." Claire felt the words settle into her chest in a way she could not immediately process, not because they were unclear, but because they rearranged everything she thought she understood about the past 2 years, about the man standing in front of her, and about herself. And for a moment she said nothing, her mind replaying that night outside the hospital with a clarity she had never experienced before, the cold concrete steps, the dim streetlights, the exhaustion that made every hour feel longer than it was. And slowly, piece by piece, fragments returned, not fully formed memories, but impressions, a man speaking to her, a question she had refused, a feeling of discomfort she had pushed aside because she had more important things to focus on. And through it all, the quiet decision she had made without thinking twice, to stay, to go back inside, to sit beside her mother's bed and pretend everything would be okay. And Claire swallowed, her voice quieter now, not defensive, not accusing, but searching. "You saw that." And Ethan nodded once, a small movement that carried more weight than any explanation. And she took a step closer without realizing it, closing a fraction of the space between them before stopping herself, aware of that invisible boundary that still remained even now. "That does not explain this," she said, her hand gesturing slightly toward the room, toward the photographs, the documents, the carefully constructed history of her life that he had built without her knowing. And for the first time since she had known him, Ethan did not answer immediately. His silence no longer controlled but conflicted, as if the truth he was holding required more than just words to be understood. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something heavier, something that felt closer to vulnerability than anything she had ever heard from him. "That night was not random," he said, and Claire's brow furrowed slightly, confusion rising again as she tried to follow the direction of his meaning. "The man who approached you," Ethan continued, his gaze steady on hers. "He was not just a stranger." And Claire felt a faint chill run through her, not from fear, but from the realization that this story was larger than she had ever imagined, that something had been happening around her, without her knowledge, something she had unknowingly stepped into. And Ethan took a slow breath, as if choosing his words carefully. "He was connected to a case my company had been investigating, something that involved people who were not careful about who they approached." And Claire's heart began to beat faster, not from panic, but from the weight of understanding beginning to form, because this was no longer about coincidence. This was about proximity, about the fact that she had been there, in the wrong place at a moment that mattered more than she had ever known. And Ethan's voice lowered slightly, not in secrecy, but in gravity. "When you refused him, when you stayed, you made yourself visible to people who do not forget faces easily." And Claire's breath caught, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what that meant, what it had meant then, what it still meant now. And Ethan held her gaze, unwavering, as he added quietly, "I could not leave that to chance." And in that moment, everything shifted again, because this was no longer just about why he had been watching her. It was about why he had never stopped. And Claire realized with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that the distance he had kept, the silence he had maintained, the rules he had never broken, were not born from indifference, but from something far more complicated, something that had been protecting her all along, even if it had also kept her completely alone. Claire stood there in the quiet weight of his words, feeling something inside her begin to unravel, not because she was afraid, but because for the first time, the distance between them had an explanation that was both more understandable and more unbearable than anything she had imagined. And she shook her head slightly, her voice no longer searching but tightening with something deeper, something more human. "So you watched me, for my safety." And Ethan did not flinch at the edge in her tone, did not step back or defend himself. He simply nodded once, the movement small but certain, and Claire let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Except there was no humor in it, only the weight of realization pressing down on her chest. "For 2 years, she continued, her eyes lifting to meet his again, clearer now, sharper. "You built an entire life around me. You married me, you kept me here, and you never thought I deserved to know." And there it was, The truth she could not ignore, not the watching, not the investigation, but the silence, the choice he had made every single day to keep her in the dark. And Ethan's expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that broke his composure, but enough that she could see it, the conflict he did not show to anyone else. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, but no longer distant. Knowing would have made you a target. And Claire felt that word settle into her mind, heavier than anything else he had said, because it carried implications she was only beginning to understand, and yet it did not erase what she felt. It did not undo the 2 years she had lived inside a marriage that had never been explained to her, and she took another step forward, closing the space just enough to challenge that invisible line he had drawn between them, her voice quiet but firm. You made that decision for me. And Ethan's gaze held hers, unwavering, as if he had expected this, as if he had prepared himself for this moment long before it arrived. Yes, he answered simply, without hesitation. And that single word hit harder than any justification could have, because it was not an excuse, it was an admission, and Claire felt something shift again, not confusion this time, not uncertainty, but clarity, sharp and undeniable, because for all the reasons he had, for all the logic behind his choices, he had still taken something from her, her right to choose, her right to understand, her right to decide what kind of life she wanted to live. And as that realization settled into place, her voice softened, not in surrender, but in something more resolute. You kept me safe, she said slowly, the words deliberate, but you also kept me alone. And for the first time since she had known him, Ethan did not have an immediate response, his silence stretching between them, no longer controlled, no longer intentional, but uncertain, as if he had reached the point where his reasoning no longer held the same certainty it once had. And Claire felt it, that shift, that crack in the distance he had maintained so carefully for 2 years, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them no longer defined by rules or contracts, but by something far more fragile, something that could not be controlled or measured. And as Claire looked at him, really looked at him without the barrier of misunderstanding, she realized something that changed everything once again. Ethan had not just been protecting her from something outside. He had also been protecting himself from something much closer, something he had never allowed himself to face. And now, standing just inches closer than they had ever been before, that distance no longer felt like protection at all. It felt like the last barrier between two people who no longer had anywhere left to hide. The silence between them did not feel empty anymore. It felt fragile, like something that had been held together for too long and was now beginning to give way under the weight of truth. And Claire could feel it in the way Ethan stood there, no longer distant in the way she had known, but not yet close enough to reach her either, as if he was standing at the edge of something he had never allowed himself to cross. And for a moment she wondered if he even knew how, because for 2 years he had lived within rules he created, boundaries he never broke, and now those same rules seemed to hold him in place just as much as they had kept her away. And she drew in a slow breath, her voice softer now, but no less steady. You said knowing would make me a target, she repeated, not as a question, but as something she was trying to understand fully, and Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze still fixed on hers, as if looking away would mean losing whatever this moment was becoming. Then why marry me? She asked, the question simple but heavier than anything else she had said, because it reached beyond the past and into the choices he had made. And for the first time, Ethan did not answer immediately, his silence stretching, not empty, but filled with something he had not yet spoken. And Claire felt her heart begin to beat faster, not from fear, but from the quiet realization that this was the question that mattered most. Not the watching, not the secrecy, but this, why he had tied his life to hers in a way that could not be undone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, as if the truth required more than just words to carry it. Because distance was not enough anymore, he said, and Claire frowned slightly, the meaning not yet clear, and he continued, his tone steady but no longer guarded. After that night, I made sure you were not alone. I had people watching from a distance, making sure nothing came near you, but the longer it went on, the more I realized that distance has limits. And Claire felt something shift again, something deeper, Because this was no longer about protection in the abstract. This was about choice, about escalation, about the moment when he decided that watching was no longer enough. So you decided to marry me, she said quietly, the words almost disbelieving, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. It was the only way to ensure that no one could reach you without going through me. And there it was, the logic, the reason, the strategy that had shaped the last 2 years of her life. And for a moment, Claire simply stood there, absorbing it, because it made sense in a way she could not deny. It connected every piece, every silence, every boundary, every carefully maintained inch of distance. But it did not make it easier to accept, because beneath that logic was something else, something far more personal, something he had still not said, and she stepped closer again, just slightly, enough that the space between them felt different now, charged, uncertain. And that is all it was, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Just protection. And Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze holding hers in a way that felt different now, less controlled, more exposed, and in that pause, Claire felt it, the truth he had not yet spoken, the one thing he had kept buried even deeper than everything else. And when he finally moved, it was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it mattered, because for the first time in 2 years, he did not step back. He did not maintain that perfect distance. He simply stood there, closer than he had ever allowed himself to be before. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but unmistakably real. No, he said. And that single word changed everything. Claire felt the weight of that single word settle into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because it was the first time in 2 years that Ethan had allowed something real to exist between them without hiding behind logic or distance. And her breath caught slightly as she searched his face, looking for something to confirm what she was beginning to understand, something to anchor this moment in truth rather than assumption. And for the first time since she had known him, Ethan did not look like a man in control of everything around him. He looked like someone standing at the edge of something he could not take back once spoken, and Claire's voice softened, not fragile, but careful, as if the wrong tone might shatter whatever this was becoming. Then what was it? She asked, and the question lingered, heavier than any silence that had come before, because it demanded something he had never given her, not protection, not explanation, but honesty. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving hers, as if looking away would mean retreating into the version of himself that had kept this hidden for so long. And when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that made her chest tighten. It stopped being just protection a long time ago, he said, and Claire felt something inside her shift, something deeper than surprise, something that had been building without her realizing it, because this was the answer she had not allowed herself to expect. And yet now that it was there, it made everything else make sense in a way that was almost overwhelming. And she took another step closer, the distance between them now so small that it no longer felt like a boundary, but like a question waiting to be answered. Then why keep me at a distance? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady, because this was the part she could not ignore, the part that had defined every day of the last 2 years. And Ethan's expression shifted again. Not in a way that broke, but in a way that revealed something he had never shown her before, something unguarded, something human. And when he answered, his words were simple, but they carried a weight she could feel in every part of her. Because the closer I got, the harder it became to keep you safe. And Claire's breath caught, not because she did not understand, but because she did, more than she wanted to, because this was not just about external danger. This was about the way he had drawn the line between them, not only to protect her from something outside, but to protect himself from something he could no longer control. And she held his gaze, her voice quieter now, but filled with something that had not been there before, something stronger than confusion, stronger than frustration. You were not just protecting me, she said slowly. You were protecting yourself. And for a moment, Ethan said nothing, but he did not deny it. And that silence was answer enough, because it confirmed what she had already begun to see, that somewhere along the way, the distance he had built had stopped being about safety alone and had become something else entirely, something that kept him from crossing a line he knew he would not be able to return from. And Claire felt her heart steady, not because this was easy, but because it was finally clear, And as she stood there, closer to him than she had ever been before, she realized that the question was no longer why he had kept his distance, but whether he was still willing to. Claire did not step back this time, did not retreat into the space that had defined them for 2 years, because something had changed in a way that could not be undone, and she could feel it in the air between them, no longer cold, no longer distant, but charged with something fragile and real. And as she looked at Ethan, truly looked at him without the weight of misunderstanding clouding her view, she saw it clearly now, not just the control, not just the restraint, but the effort it had taken to hold himself back every day, every moment, every step he had chosen not to take. And her voice was quiet, but steady, carrying the clarity she had fought to reach. "Then stop," she said, and the word lingered between them, simple but powerful, because it was not a demand, not an accusation, but an invitation. And Ethan's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that she could see it, the hesitation, the uncertainty, the conflict of a man who had spent 2 years building walls and now stood at the edge of tearing them down. And for a moment, he did not move, as if the space between them still held meaning, still held rules he had not yet decided to break. And Claire took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make that line almost invisible, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "You said distance was the only way to keep me safe," she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "But I have been standing right here for 2 years, and nothing has happened." And there was no defiance in her tone, only truth, because whatever danger had existed, whatever reason he had carried for so long, it had not reached her, not once, not in a way she could see. And Ethan's gaze held hers, searching, as if weighing something he had never allowed himself to consider before. And Claire felt her heart steady, not because this was easy, but because it was finally honest. "You cannot protect me from everything," she said quietly. "And you cannot protect yourself from this either." And there it was, the truth laid bare between them, not wrapped in logic or explanation, but simple and undeniable. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching, not empty, but filled with the weight of choice. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan took a step forward, the movement, small but significant, because it was the first time in 2 years that he had crossed that invisible line without hesitation, without pulling back, without stopping himself. And Claire felt her breath catch, not from surprise, but from the quiet realization of what that step meant, because it was not just movement, it was a decision. And he stopped just in front of her now, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence in a way she never had before, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance at all. And for a moment, he said nothing, his gaze steady, searching hers as if asking a question he could not put into words. And Claire did not look away, did not retreat, because this was the moment everything had been leading to, not the contract, not the silence, not the distance, but this, the point where both of them had to decide whether to remain where they had always been, or step into something real. And when Ethan finally spoke, his voice was quieter than ever, but clearer than it had ever been. "If I stop," he said slowly, "there is no going back." And Claire felt something warm and steady settle in her chest, because for the first time, that did not feel like a risk, it felt like the truth. And she met his gaze without hesitation, her answer just as quiet, just as certain. "Then do not go back." For a moment, nothing moved, not the air, not the space between them, not even the quiet rhythm of time that had always existed around them, because everything had come down to this, a single choice that would either keep them where they had always been or change everything they had built over the last 2 years. And Claire held his gaze without hesitation, her answer still lingering between them, steady and certain. And Ethan stood there, closer than he had ever allowed himself to be, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but something else entirely, something real, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for far too long. And then, slowly, almost carefully, as if aware of the weight behind even the smallest movement, he lifted his hand, not quickly, not impulsively, but with intention. And for the first time in 2 years, there was no hesitation in the space between them, no invisible line stopping him, no rule pulling him back. And Claire felt her breath catch as his hand moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth before the contact even happened. And then, gently, simply, his fingers brushed against hers, a touch so light it could have been missed, and yet it changed everything. Because it was real, because it was chosen, because it was the first time he had allowed himself to cross that distance. And Claire did not pull away, did not question it. She simply stood there, feeling the reality of it settle into her. The quiet certainty that this was not just a moment. It was a beginning, and Ethan's hand remained there, not gripping, not holding tightly, just present, just enough to close the space that had existed for so long. And when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, but stronger than anything he had said before. "I should have told you," he said, and there was no defense in his words, no justification, only truth. And Claire nodded slightly, because she knew that, had always known, that something had been missing between them. But now, standing here, feeling his presence in a way she never had before, it no longer felt like something that could not be fixed. "You did not," she replied quietly, her voice calm, steady, not accusing, just honest. And Ethan's gaze did not waver, because this was not about what had been lost. It was about what came next, and slowly, without breaking the connection between them, he shifted closer, closing the final inch of space that had remained. And Claire felt it, not just the physical closeness, but the absence of distance, the absence of everything that had kept them apart. And for the first time in 2 years, there was nothing between them but choice. And she let out a quiet breath, something soft and unguarded, as she looked up at him, her voice carrying a warmth that had never had a place before. "Then do not make the same mistake again." And Ethan's expression softened, not in a way that lost its strength, but in a way that revealed something he had kept hidden for too long. And as he held her gaze, his hand still resting against hers, he nodded once. A simple promise without words, and in that moment, the contract that had defined their marriage, the distance that had shaped their lives, the silence that had filled every room in that house, all of it faded into something smaller, something that no longer held power over what they were becoming. And as the quiet of the night settled around them once more, it no longer felt empty. It felt full, not with answers, not with certainty, but with something far more important, something they had both chosen at the same time, without hesitation, without fear. And for the first time since the day they were married, Claire Dawson did not feel like a stranger in her own life, and Ethan Blackwood did not feel like a man standing alone behind walls he could not escape, because the distance between them was gone, replaced by something simple, something real, something that had been waiting for 2 years to finally exist.